Okay, so this point of view comes from Colden Hopkins. No doubt the US is the land of opportunity. If it wasn't, we wouldn't have people coming here in droves. I totally agree. I was waiting 1 year in the midst of the pandemic for the visa and spent, I would say, the 2 happiest years of my life.
The Economist uses this metric of democracy where they don't say whether a country is democratic or not. They say whether it's more or less democratic than Turkey, because that's like their baseline, their middle ground. Like Turkey's like half a democracy, half not. And so I think when we're like ranking countries in terms of acceptance, immigration, the US is definitely up there, but we're not where we need to be in terms of tolerance. There's a lot to do.
I absolutely agree with the statement that you shared in the text, and I share the same point of view as Angela. The reason the 1,500 troops were sent to the border yesterday is because we have United States Border Patrol agents that are law enforcement officials to ensure that we have an orderly and secure border, because no nation without borders or law and order has ever existed, right? A nation without laws will cease to exist. And we have a legal immigration system that has served as the bedrock of this country. It allows great people like Angela to come here to pursue an education, to pursue career opportunities, to live their American dream. But those should be legal pathways. And over the past 2 years with this current president in office, if I may say, we've seen the total abuse of that legal immigration system. There's been more than 2.3 million illegal people in this country, many of them known terrorists from our enemies around the world, such as Russia and China. Our leaders in government, both sides of the aisle, they need to put the people that live here first, law-abiding citizens. We are the United States of America. We have an American people. And so I fundamentally disagree. We are the most accepting nation in the world, and we can't just allow lawlessness or else we're going to hurt our own people.
What I would say to that is that seeking refuge from unstable economic and political situations shouldn't be illegal. Crossing the border shouldn't be illegal. The issue isn't whether, it's lawlessness. It's just that should be a law to begin with.
We have a legal asylum seeking process in this
country. But it's flawed and it doesn't work well enough. I mean, Angela just said she was waiting for a visa for a year.
It's absolutely flawed. Our legal immigration system has been flawed for decades, but we also cannot allow the abuse of that legal immigration system. The 3.2 million illegal people that have come here have abused that system, taken advantage of it. The number one demographic of those coming here illegally are single males.
I'm a single male. Should I leave the United States?
No, I'm saying they're not women and children that are seeking asylum and violence. They are people that are coming here because they know our border is wide open. And that's the abuse of our legal immigration system.
So what though? So what if our border is open?
We should understand who's in this country. We need law and order, or we will be taken advantage of. Iran is a country that chants death to America, and they are sending known terrorists on the terrorist watch list to our nation to seek harm. 70 of them have been caught by our border patrol. A gentleman that was an illegal immigrant, he was deported previously 4 times. He executed 5 of his neighbors in broad daylight. That's someone who that's not someone who should just be openly walking over our border. I would hope you agree with that.
I agree with that. At the same time, that's one person out of several million, as you mentioned, and we have to prioritize human rights at the end of the day.
I think that this is an extremely important conversation to be having, especially in the midst of the argument of whether or not America is great. I also think that, Sam, what you mentioned about socioeconomic and political and even human rights related reasons that people flee countries, that's also an extremely important conversation to have when it comes to deciding whether or not this country is great, because a lot of the destabilizations that have happened in countries across the world, our government has had a hand in. So when we start putting ourselves on a pedestal again of what does an ideal democracy look like, we also have to look at the impacts that we've had in destabilizing other foreign nations and the reasons why those citizens may find refuge or be fighting as hard as they are to be here and to live here.
I actually agree with you on that. I don't think the United States should be intervening in every international dispute. There are wars in this world that we shouldn't have a hand in.
If you hate living in America so much, why don't you leave?
I don't think any of us said we hate living in America.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I don't think that criticizing this country is akin to saying that you hate this country. Personally, I've never particularly identified as a patriotic person, but I'm very open about the fact that this country has a lot of potential to be the beacon of democracy and to be this perfect nation that we're all sitting here discussing whether or not it is. But I would be remiss to not utilize the freedoms that we do have to critique our government, to critique our structure. And I also think that in a world where we are constantly seeing America put in this comparative light with other democracies, with other nations in general, we have to stop associating this idea that our country has good as accepting mediocrity. I think that in the global scheme of governments, of democracies, of human rights, we have to set a standard that is that ideal, that is perfect, rather than saying, oh, well, we're good enough because we give this group this and we give this group that, and we're not doing what this country's doing, so yay us. That's not good enough.
I would also like to chime in here. Even though as an immigrant, I said all positive. Also, I can spot some negatives there as well. For example, as a climate activist, I would have thought that country with such a budget and such opportunities would be miles and miles away on the climate journey, but we just signed Project Willow, which is completely opposite of everything we all have been dreaming of. Thinking about how America has been failing all of us on the climate journey is also one thing we should all criticize about, because as Sam and Anya mentioned, we cannot compare ourselves, for example, with my country.
What does that look like, though? Like that, of course we always want to strive for perfection. I don't think it exists as humans and also as a nation. We've come damn close in America, and that's my opinion. But what does that look like to you guys, like that perfect utopia? What do you think should get better in order for us to achieve that perfection as a country?
I don't think we're talking about a perfect utopia. I think that's sort of it's an unrealistic aim. The goalposts have to constantly shift based on what people need and what people want. And so we have to strive for perfection even if we know we're never going to reach it. That is, to me, like what being an American means. It's that idealism. That's the American dream. Always moving forward, because it will never be enough. We can always improve people's lives even more. As far as, an ideal vision, people not having to work so hard to earn so little, people who can spend their time enjoying themselves, spending time with friends and family, being involved in their communities, just enjoying your life. We have to focus on maximizing human happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction.
And I'm sure that drives a lot of the work you do, Sam. Like, I'm such an admirer of your platform, Path to Progress, and I think that's what it embodies, right? That we should be striving to create progress in whatever way the goalpost is moving for our generation.
I definitely agree with that. I also think that, the greatest country in the world should be constantly striving to ensure that its citizens are thriving rather than surviving. And I think that that's the main differentiator when we start talking about where America stands on that totem pole. There are so many ways that our government can actively contribute to making that obsolete that it simply hasn't. And I think that that's kind of, a core basis of why there's even disagreement on this couch right now.
I agree, right? Like, we all want everyone to achieve personal happiness and success and fulfillment. But I don't believe that's ever going to come from the government. I believe in individualism very strongly, and I believe faith in something greater than ourselves is very important when finding fulfillment. Realizing we're all humans, we have an inevitable end on this life. I think, having good family and personal relationships in your life is very important to achieving that personal success and fulfillment as well. Then ensuring we live in a country that allows everyone to achieve something. And mainly that means, fiscally, right? We were, I believe, seeing that we had record low unemployment, wages were up, the economy was more affordable for everyone, mortgage rates were incredibly low, people were purchasing homes, and now we've seen that deteriorate in a few short years, and I think it's very discouraging for so many of us, right? I'm sure we're all on this couch stuck in the rental rabbit hole, as I like to call it. I think that's, again, because of a greater government. The government is never going to solve your problems for you. It can be helpful, yes, but it's never going to help you achieve true fulfillment and success. And I think as Americans, we've become very dependent on that idea.
I definitely agree that an emphasis on community and something larger than self is important. But the government is an embodiment of our broad national community. We're democratically electing people to Congress, to the presidency, more or less democratically. The government captures the collective will of the nation, and that's something that we need. Public policy does have the impact that you say it does, and it does have the ability to lift people out of poverty, to let people become self-actualized, to realize their potential. There are lots of direct impacts that elections and legislation have on everyday Americans.
That's part of the reason I ran for Congress myself, right?
Yeah.
And launched a congressional campaign, because I think it's very important we elect leaders who genuinely want to do good for the people. And we've lost that on both sides, progressives, conservatives. We have way too many corrupt career politicians in Washington, D.C. and at every level of government that are there for the wrong reasons and not really wanting to uplift the constituents in which they, took an oath to serve. But those people, aren't going to save you. And look no further than a nation like Venezuela that crumbled under the guise of government intervention, saving every person in that country Before you know it, people were handing over their property, their personal incomes to the government. They were in bread lines, then they were eating zoo animals. Imagine that in the United States of America, if we continually become slaves to the government by giving away our personal income, our personal freedoms over to these people that are supposed to save us, we will be enslaved to them real quick. And those people are corrupt and they're powerful and they're going to want to cling to that. And we've seen that time and time again in history, and I fear we're not that far along from that.
I think I side more with Sam in the respect that our government is the glass ceiling through which we all function under. And I think that when we talk about the social and the socioeconomic barriers that a lot of people are trying to neutralize now, we genuinely need the reinforcement of our government simply because the foundations from which we're building are so uneven and so shifty that whatever we manage to make progress on now simply will not be sustainable if our government does not back us in some way, shape, or form. And there's a lot of talk about things like reparations, things like socioeconomic infrastructural development that needs to happen for communities like predominantly Black and Latinx communities to even begin to see this equalization or, socioeconomic equity that we're continuously fighting for. And while I don't think a lot of people would agree with the fact that we need to look to one person for all of our leadership, we would be remiss to not acknowledge the power that our government has to set the precedent for our society and for our democracy. Saying that we need to completely relinquish dependency on our government kind of gives them the opportunity to no longer need to be held accountable for the power that they have, for the power they choose not to use or execute.
Caroline, that you said the Constitution is like one of the most beautiful documents ever written, and the intent behind it is to have a fairly large federal government. I mean, federalism is enshrined into the Constitution. There is local power, yes, but the collective nature of the United States necessitates like a federal approach to policymaking.
Federalism meaning, more power to the states, right? The 10th Amendment gave more power to those closest to the people, the power of the pen to the state legislatures to make laws, whether that was electoral reform. Each state has its own culture. Our founding fathers recognized that very early. The people of New York certainly feel different than the people of my home state of New Hampshire. And so the constituents in each state should have the power to elect those that will make laws that more closely align to their values. The federal government's original intention was really for two things. It was to protect our homeland and to protect the Constitution, which we've seen time and time again. The federal government is infringing all over First Amendment rights, censoring and silencing people that the current administration doesn't agree with. Second Amendment rights being trampled on every single day. That's a pretty clear amendment in our Constitution for a reason, and you see laws passed every day in states across this country that infringe on that. So
I just want to mention, I don't know how you guys realize that how U.S. has impact not only here in the people of the U.S. but like the whole world. So when elections in the U.S. are happening, the whole world is watching. So I remember I was like 8 years old when I like watched my first U.S. election. If we send signals like here in the U.S. having the greatest recidivism rates, like shootings in primary schools every month, sending these messages to the broader world really impact, because we see these trends not happening in Europe. That impact that U.S. sends through like its power, it's intense. So we have to think of how it impacts other broader population rather than here.
I was doing some research heading into our conversation today, and I didn't know if you knew this stat, but 88% of all Gen Zers feel that Black Americans are treated differently than others in our country. So I'd love to ask you all if you feel that America is a racist country.
Yes.
Yeah?
Without a doubt, absolutely. I would have to say so.
Yeah. I would defer to the one person of color. Yeah.
Don't defer. I'm
Well, I'll defer, but I also agree.
Yeah, sure. Like my experience coming from more of a primary perspective, so someone agreeing from a secondary or even tertiary perspective is something that I think is also extremely important. I say I would have to absolutely agree. There will never be a day that I don't agree, simply because a large part of what makes our country stand out in the global scheme of things is our invention of, the Atlantic slave trade. I think that an attempt in our, current society to erase the history behind how this country even got the socioeconomic standing that it did. And I think a huge part of that being the transatlantic slave trade, being the marginalization and true kidnapping of Black people from Africa, from the Caribbean, from multiple nations across the world, and bringing them here to spend the next 400, 500 years being forced to build the infrastructure and the institutions that still to this day do not benefit us the same, do not see us, do not value us, do not acknowledge our contribution or our existence even. And I think that when people start to talk about the feasibility of the American dream and this idea that, the United States provides that opportunity to everyone is simply not true, because we are still seeing a lack of acknowledgement of the existence of slavery from multiple people. We are constantly hearing about how long ago slavery ended, how long ago the Ku Klux Klan was the keystone of our government. We're hearing these stories about Black history and about slavery as if they are so far removed from our current society and our current socioeconomic position in the world, and it simply isn't. Despite how much progress we've made, and despite the expectation being that by this time we shouldn't be seeing any echoes of slavery or racism in our society, but we are. And that's a huge point of disappointment and critique, especially, as a Black woman in the Black community. We are constantly making this a conversation, especially because we see how many steps we've taken, how much progress we have made. But I think that the progress helps to almost emphasize the time spent, the lack of urgency, the lack of accountability taken to the things that are still not remedied, to the things that are still kind of brushed under the rug in terms of what the problems still are. And I think that a lot of people also refuse to acknowledge that when you spend 400 years building a foundation on a community's back, and then when you finally pull them out from under all the rubble, you expect them to just run the race like everybody else and not complain. That's simply not feasible. I think that everyone has a right to strive, and everyone should be encouraged to strive the same. But it's important that people in power understand that the level playing field is simply a fantasy, and that there are infrastructural, systematic barriers that have put people of color in a way off-ramp position to not only have to struggle harder, but to not be accepted simply for their image. Talk to a lot of my friends who have come from other countries about is this idea that in America, it doesn't matter what you look like. People accept you. People are willing to hear your perspective. People are willing to open the door for you. For Black and Latinx people, for Indigenous people, that is not true. It's simply false. I could have 10 times more qualifications than Carolyn in any given room and still be denied a job or still be denied an opportunity simply because of my superior's prerequisites about what it means for me to be a Black woman, what it means for me to be a woman, what it means for me to be Black. In a nation where that sentence is true, we can't ignore the fact that racism is a huge part of what our foundation was birthed from and what our founding documents are simply laced with. That is a huge stain on our legacy. I think that's a huge stain on this idea that we are the land of the free. And I think that until people can acknowledge the hypocrisy in that, until people can acknowledge that there is still a massive gap that needs to be filled in the socioeconomic inequity and inequality that people of color have had to face, until we acknowledge that, we simply will not be able to move forward.
As someone who's been in technology for this couple of years, every technology that is built to make this country better is so racist. For example, we have this device called the shot spotter, which is invented to help people know where there is a shooting happening. And by any chance, all the shot spotters are placed in like communities that are completely like Black or Latin, where we are just having this over-policing issue. Also, the technology that is built in the airports that is like recognizing us. For example, I know because I have an accent, how like sometimes I'll have problem to just detect my voice, but there are millions of other people who will be Black or Asian or any other race that will have even greater problems than me to be recognized by these systems. So yes, a lot of like companies are pushing, are trying. All the technology that is built for white people, and I would say mostly white men.
What you said is very heartfelt, and I'm sorry that you feel that way, and I'm sorry that's been your lived experience in this country. I really truly am. It's sad to hear you speak in that way. And slavery, racism is a part of our past. It's absolutely something that I believe needs to be taught to every American child in every school in this country. And the contributions that Black and brown people made to this country are indelible. We couldn't have made this country without them. You said something that was interesting to me and curious to me. You said, in our current day, we have institutions that don't recognize the existence of Black or brown people. I'm not a Black or brown person, so I can't resonate with that, right? Because that's not my lived experience. What do you mean by that? Like, what institutions? Are government institutions, or higher education, university system, Hollywood? Like, what is it?
No. So the statement that I made about recognition is not so much recognizing the existence. It's more so of acknowledgement. Because I think that oftentimes we paint our nation as diverse across the board, that we are accepting, that we are this melting pot of people, and that we strive for that day in and day out, both on our social level and on our governmental level. However, in government, we see that when we elect people into power, for example, who are toting this idea that, all I want to do is push for that, push for, this democratic amplification of quality, of diversity, of inclusion, the demographics that are consistently left out of our legislative conversations are fascinating. We see legislation passed all the time regarding LGBTQIA+ people, addressing the immigration community, addressing, youth even, addressing multiple facets of marginalized demographics, but we have not seen legislation that addresses the disenfranchisement of the Black community. The Democratic Party, who is painted consistently as being the most progressive, the most liberal, has never had an agenda to address the Black community. But we've seen legislation passed about AAPI hate. We've seen legislation passed about so many other things. We've seen reparations handed out to the Jewish community, to the Japanese community over the course of countless years for good reason.
It's such a fascinating topic to me because it's obviously such a hot button issue. I feel like every debate these days surrounds around race and gender and intangible characteristics, rather. The issues harming these communities, mainly within our inner cities, right? Because that's where mainly minority communities reside. Fatherlessness in homes, crime, lawlessness. And I think there needs to be efforts within those communities from a legislative standpoint to solve those issues. And I think we've actually seen a regression in a lot of these areas over the past few years. A place like Chicago where minority on minority crime has actually shot through the roof. It's so devastating. It's so tragic. Last year alone, I think 695 people were murdered in one American city. That's 2 people a day. The victims of those crimes were African American men. Nobody talks about that. Nobody's putting forth tangible solutions to solve these issues that seem to be really impacting these communities. We have a lot of platitudes thrown around, like, okay, what are we doing to ensure these people are living in safe and prosperous environments? So I guess we agree on that point, like what legislatively and tangibly is being done. And then one more point I'll add, and then I think Sam's itching to speak based on your body language. Yeah. I think we've had this notion lately, I don't know if it's just over the past few years, but of over-representation and I'm going to hire this person just because she's a woman. I ran for office. I didn't want one person to vote for me just because I'm a young female. I never tried to use that on the campaign trail because I want you to vote for me because I'm the best damn person for this job. Because I'm better than any man, any person of color, any characteristic you want to throw out there. And we've seen all these hires at the highest levels of our government. Oh, I'm going to hire this person because she's an African American woman. What? Let's hire the best people for the job. We should be a meritocracy, not a government or a country that just hires people and has this hyper focus and emphasis on race and religion and gender. We're all American, right? That's the one thing I think that combines us all. Over-representation is actually detrimental to our society because it makes all of us consciously view one another in that light rather than just viewing each other as good human beings and Americans. And you brought up that stat, what was it, 88% of Gen Zers think this is a racist country? I think that hyper-focus on representation may be a large part of it.
I just don't know if you can escape it. Yeah. Right? I feel like so much of who we are is our identities.
Right.
I personally hear what you're saying. I think it's sometimes hard to separate the two. And while I agree, I think we should absolutely strive to put the best possible people for specific roles in those roles. I do think it's important that we strive to represent more and more people.
Yeah, I just think a lot of what we see in modern day America is actually antithetical to what the civil rights movement was about, right? MLK Jr. infamously said, I want people to view each other on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And we seem to be reverting backwards a little bit on that front.
There's a lot to respond to there. I would say that the first thing that comes to mind is that very often people who represent marginalized communities are also the best people for the job. And that when we say, oh, someone just got hired because they're Black or because they're a woman or because they're disabled, that doesn't mean that they're not qualified for the job just because they're not this prototypical idea of a well-off Anglo-American white man. There's a lot of overlap between your talent and any demographic feature that you have.
We also refuse to talk about who is at fault for the disenfranchisement that is seen in predominantly Black communities, but also just low-income communities in general. We are consistently seeing examples of white supremacist systems and institutions consistently putting forth practices and instituting not only policy, but just there's such a complex argument around this. But I think that when you look at neighborhoods that have been bulldozed in the name of and in the success of white institutions, and then you see the socioeconomic downpours that happen in those communities, the impacts of those white institutions are almost never mentioned as being the core of those problems. And I think that because of that, we're consistently brought up to believe like, oh, well, if you're a Black person living in poverty, then there's nothing really stopping you from still pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, we all have a hard life. We all have things that we have to deal with. But there are so many institutional barriers that have been put in the paths of people of color, of low-income communities of color, that simply do not exist in the same ways for other communities and other demographics. Socioeconomic barriers honestly have very little pull on the impacts that things like police brutality have on us. I'm someone that lived in an upper middle class community my whole life, and I am still just as at risk of being shot by a police officer as any other Black person walking down the street. And I think that that fact is something that a lot of people try to attribute to, oh, well, police violence on the Black community is often only seen in inner cities, or we only see, instances of spikes in arrests, or, the pouring in of police precincts to predominantly Black and Latinx communities as being the only environments where these things happen. And that's simply not true. Even mass incarceration as an issue that's constantly talked about in the Black community, that innately is a form of modernized slavery. When we eradicated slavery as a concept, our government was a part of establishing amendments that created loopholes for people to, of course, not be subject to slavery unless they could, of course, be accused of a crime. And then you create this society where, okay, I'm going to make sure that I become efficient in categorizing you as a criminal. I'm going to make sure that I normalize a culture where people don't need to categorize you off the context of your character to determine that you are suspicious, to determine that you may be dangerous. And those implicit biases really do infect the mindset of people in power today, whether that be in corporate America, whether that be in government, and not acknowledging that those implicit biases exist is a huge part of the problem as to why we continue to talk about these issues as if they are in and of themselves isolated from the impacts of white supremacy.
Thank you all so much. You're sharing so many important aspects of this conversation. I would just love to spend the time that we have left focusing on Gen Z, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just to bring it back.
The Republican Party as it exists now is going to die out if things don't change. We're too worried about paying our rent to care about drag queens or what women do with their bodies. They're alienating the people in our generation who actually agree with them on a lot of other things. I actually agree with this take. This is something, as a Generation Z Republican, I have been very vocal on. It's part of the reason I decided to run for office myself, because for a few years now, we have seen our generation, young voters, turning out in droves for the Democrat Party. I fundamentally believe that's to our own detriment. We have seen, and I will just use the past 2 years as an example, because we've had a Democrat president in the White House, and we've had a Democrat leadership in the Senate and on both chambers on Capitol Hill. And since they have been in office, the lives of Gen Zers has become more difficult. If we want to vote for people who want us to succeed, who want us to achieve the American dream, who want us to be able to purchase homes, have families, have affordable education, by the way. Democrats love to talk about affordable education. That's actually an issue that I think Republicans have made good strides on. We believe in school choice. We believe in every child being able to go to any school that they want to that fits their needs, regardless of race, religion, income, zip code, where you live, what your parents do for work. We've put forth policies that I think are actually very helpful to Gen Zers. Our opposition, the Democrat Party, has been better when it comes to messaging on those issues. And so I'm hopeful in my work I'll be able to get the Republican Party up to speed when it comes to investing in digital infrastructure to just ensure young people hear what our party stands for, which is economic freedom, which is making sure you can walk outside in the city of New York and not feel like you're going to be threatened, right? We believe in law and order, safe communities, a prosperous country, and also peace around the world. The past couple of years we've seen really chaos ensue around our globe. We had a terribly botched withdrawal from Afghanistan in the Middle East, which was an endless war. I agree with the decision to pull out of that war, but the way that it was led by our current Democrat commander-in-chief was atrocious, and that led to the deaths of 13 young men and women from our generation. And as Gen Zers, we need to understand and recognize that if this country goes to war, It's going to be us who are suiting up to go fight that war. And our very privileged American life as we know it will end real quick if China and Russia and Iran and these countries that hate us take over this country and our American way of life. And I believe the Republican Party is best positioned to ensure that doesn't happen, is best positioned to stabilize the world, strengthen our military, deter our communist enemies, and keep America as this free and beautiful country that we are so blessed and privileged to live in.
As a person on a visa that cannot vote, I just want to mention that before we go to wars, we can die out of climate change, and not one nor the other party has addressed climate change as we know it. So during till 2020, 2021, we were out of the Paris Agreement, which has been a very bad problem. When countries like mine, small countries with 2 million people, have signed the Paris Agreement, US till 2020 hasn't. That has really put us back on the progress of climate change, and we're still not helping the people, the small island, who need desperately our help, because without them, if they start to fail, we start to fail as well. One threat that is closer than the wars and all of the terrorist attacks that can happen is the climate change that we have to work upon.
There are lots of ways we can die, is what you're all saying.
Yeah, 100%. Something I've noticed just from the conversations I've had with each of you and countless other people in our generation is that the more and more we grow up, the more we start to reject the two-party system. I've started to notice this trend in our generation specifically, that the divide between us is less so left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, but more so a divide on whether we think that we should fix what is broken and work within the sandbox we've got, or if we should burn it all down and start over again. So I'd love to ask you, as you think about where we go from here and build the future that we want for ourselves and our kids, but also just a better America, what's your take on that?
I understand the impulse to want to burn everything down and just start over, start fresh. At the same time, that kind of change isn't sustainable. Revolutions like that don't work. It's also just not an idealistic model of change in a democracy. Fundamentally, what happens when we have those sorts of transitions is that power shifts not from an elite group to the general public, but from one elite group to another. And that's the case for pretty much every revolution, including the American Revolution. To have comprehensive, sustainable change, it has to happen not slowly, but at a rate that's maintainable.
Completely abolishing our democracy may not be a sustainable way of change, nor do I think that it would be the most productive way to think about how to enforce and inspire change, at least in our current day. I think that there are a lot of systems within our government or within our society that could use some abolitionist mindset. The conversation around a redesign of a lot of the ways that our government currently functions is necessary. I think that one of the reasons why, abolitionist perspectives have been really idolized and pushed to the forefront, especially when it comes to our government and even in our, more social microcosms, is because of how much resistance we see when we are simply trying to bring up these conversations of a governmental redesign, of reforms, of trying to neutralize any parts of our systems that are currently appearing unequal or inequitable. So I definitely think that it isn't harmful to have abolitionist mindsets about certain things, about the nuances, about the systems. But I think that saying that our democracy inherently would only survive if we burn the whole thing down and start from scratch kind of relinquishes its accountability to uphold those standards that it wrote its founding documents trying to uphold. And I think that as citizens, it's our responsibility to continue pushing for our nation to not only live up to those standards, but even exceed them.
The way people here take risks and the way people here innovate and create companies, create wonders is unparalleled. So I would say these values are what really make America great. So burning it up from the ground, it's something that we shouldn't be aiming for.
I wanted to share, I don't know if you knew this, but we're partnering on this episode with an amazing organization called Made by Us. They wanted us to ask a specific question today that I want to kind of wrap up our segment with. What is one thing that you're proud of about our country?
I'm proud of the aspirational quality of America, like I was talking about earlier, this idea that the goalposts are always shifting, that we have to be looking ahead and having conversations like these to reassess the needs of the American people and what we can do to improve our society, because those improvements, there's always room for them.
I'm here talking in New York City, then I'll go back to school and present and be this woman in computer science and then be a speaker and be whoever I want without someone putting me in borders.
I think that the culture of outspokenness that our country has cultivated, whether it be a result of its woes or a result of its more idealistic principles, I think that is a really unique keystone of what this nation has managed to encourage and cultivate. But whether that outspokenness comes from our desire to critique our government or whether that outspokenness comes from our desire to express our pride, I think that the fact that we're even in a position to express that is something that makes our nation very unique. And I think that that lies within the people and the community that we hold as American citizens. And I think that that's something to be talked about for sure.
I actually agree. And I was going to go there too. It's our people. Looking back at history, right? We are the most resilient, intelligent people in the world, and innovative people in the world as well. We have been there for other countries in their desperate times of need. Look at World War I, World War II. It was our boys who stormed the beaches of Normandy and changed the tide of that world war. It was our men and women who, went into the Middle East after 9/11 to protect our homeland. Time and time again, America has been there when the world has needed us most. We are a resilient people. It's always my prayer every day that we can all remember that regardless, again, of race, religion, or creed, we are also blessed to live here. And the fact that we can even sit on this couch and have a lot more disagreements, I think, than agreements, but still have that common respect for one another and wish each other genuinely the best is really unique to us as Americans.
That's what I'm feeling coming out of this conversation. I don't know if it's always possible, but each of you listened more than I feel that you spoke today. And I think that's something so beautiful. Although I personally feel that America is flawed and we should be able to critique it, like a lot of what you spoke about, Anya, I feel incredibly grateful that at least what America represents in terms of striving for a democracy where everyone should have a voice and be afforded those opportunities, while it may not be existing in the way we would want it to, is something that makes me incredibly proud to live here. But we got a lot of work left to do, a lot of more conversations to have. So we're going to take a little quick break and then we'll be joined by a very exciting guest.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Abby Benton from the Conversationalist community. Thanks so much for watching our POVz episode on America. The best part about TC is that we want to hear everyone's points of view, including yours. Just text the word USA to 1-877-222-1119 to get access to all things TC, and we hope to feature you on a future episode. See you next time!
I know we're going to be great friends. That's the ingredient. That's the equation to me for any good conversation. Some balance between humility and curiosity.